And my name is Caitlin Dixon, and I'm a 27-year-old sergeant in the United States Army. That day at Joint Base Charleston was supposed to be the proudest moment of my life. But as I stood on the dais, the metal not yet warm against my chest, I saw my stepfather, Cruz, rise from the crowd. He wasn't clapping. He reached into his jacket, and I saw the glint of metal. A single pop tore through the humid South Carolina air, and a searing pain ripped through my hip. Amid the screams, I heard only his calm, fabricated voice ring out. "I told you you'd be nothing without me." The blood bloomed, staining my dress uniform, crimson, but I gritted my teeth, forced my body to remain erect, and completed my ceremonial salute. He thought that bullet was the end. He was wrong. It was the opening shot of a war he could never win. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button. And subscribe if you've ever had the very people who were supposed to build you up try to tear you down. The heat in Charleston was a physical weight. It pressed down on the parade ground, shimmering above the asphalt, and worked its way under the collar of my Army service uniform. The wool felt heavy, suffocating. But the pride was heavier still. It was a solid, grounding presence in my chest, a feeling I had earned through sweat, fear, and sheer, stubborn will. I stood at attention, spine rigid, eyes fixed forward, listening to the citations being read. This was it. The culmination of everything. The proof. Then my eyes scanned the crowd. Hundreds of faces, soldiers, families, civilians, all blurred into a sea of support. Except for two. My mother, Margaret, sat with a smile so tight it looked like it might shatter. And beside her, him. Cruz. He wasn't smiling. His gaze was possessive, a silent warning that radiated across the field. It was the same look he'd given me my entire life, the look that said, "I own you. Every success you have is mine to grant or take away." A familiar, cold dread snaked its way up my spine, the feeling of a child who knows they're about to be punished, even when they've done nothing wrong. For exceptional meritorious service and valor. Sergeant Caitlin Dixon. My name echoed from the speakers. The words seemed to describe someone else, a hero forged in the dust of Afghanistan, a leader, a soldier who had faced down the enemy without flinching. That person wasn't the girl Cruz had raised. He would never acknowledge her existence. As I walked toward the dais to receive my Army Commendation Medal, each step felt like a declaration. This ceremony wasn't just about a medal. It was my statement of independence. I've escaped you. But I was wrong. I had only escaped the house, not the war. The explosion wasn't like the ones on the battlefield. Those were impersonal, the sound of chaos. This was different. It was sharp, intimate, a single, venomous crack aimed directly at me. Then came the pain. It wasn't a dull ache. It was a white-hot poker driven into my left hip. A searing agony that stole my breath and sent the world tilting violently on its axis. The perfectly manicured lawn, the blue sky, the crisp flags, they all blurred into a nauseating swirl of color. For one horrifying second, I wanted to fall. I wanted to collapse into a heap and become that helpless 7-year-old girl back in Goose Creek, the one who learned that silence was safer than tears. But then another voice cut through the fog of pain. A voice forged in the crucible of basic training at Fort Jackson. "Soldier, you never turn your back. Soldier, you never fall." It wasn't a memory. It was a command etched into my very bones. It was the reflex that had been drilled into me through thousands of hours of training, the discipline that had become my armor. My vision cleared. I locked my eyes on the American flag, its stars and stripes waving defiantly against the chaos. The screams of the crowd were a distant roar. The only thing that mattered was the mission. And in that moment, the mission was to stand. I brought my right hand up in a salute, the movement crisp and precise, even as my legs trembled and a wave of dizziness threatened to pull me under. My blood was spilling, staining the dark blue fabric of my trousers, but my honor wasn't. Somewhere in the screaming crowd, an old, grizzled AP photographer, a veteran of a dozen war zones, lifted his camera and captured the image that would later win him a Pulitzer. The bloody salute. General Robert Whitaker didn't move like a 60-year-old man. He moved like a commander whose perimeter had been breached. His fury wasn't loud, it was ice-cold and absolute, a palpable force that cut through the panic. "Apprehend him," he roared, his voice the unmistakable sound of command. And the military police moved as one, a swift, efficient machine. The world was starting to go dark at the edges, but I saw him kneel beside me. He didn't look at me with pity. He looked at me with the profound respect of one soldier for another. He placed a steadying hand on my shoulder. "Sergeant," he said, his voice firm, unwavering, "you have fulfilled your duty. Now, let us handle the rest." His words were more than comfort. They were a promise. They were the validation from the father figure I'd always craved. A stark contrast to the man now being slammed against a vehicle in handcuffs. Even then, Cruz showed no remorse. Restrained, his carefully constructed mask of the respectable local businessman finally shattered, he started shouting. Lies poured from him, crafted to control the narrative even in defeat. "She's unstable. She has PTSD. She's a danger to everyone," he screamed, his voice laced with manufactured panic. But no one was listening to him anymore. Every soldier on that field, from the highest-ranking officer to the youngest private, was looking at me. And in their eyes, I saw not pity, but awe. They weren't seeing a victim. They were seeing a sergeant who, even after being shot, refused to fall. As the medics carefully lifted me onto a gurney, I looked past General Whitaker's shoulder, and my eyes met Cruz's one last time. His were filled with a wild-cornered fury. He expected tears, fear, collapse. I gave him nothing. My face was a blank mask of discipline, but my eyes delivered the message loud and clear. You've already lost. This war had just begun, and for the first time, we were fighting it on my home turf. As they rushed me toward the ambulance, the acrid smell of gunpowder and the panicked shouts of the crowd began to fade, replaced by something else rising from the depths of my memory. It was the scent of freshly cut grass after a summer storm in Goose Creek. And then I heard it, not with my ears, but in my soul. The low, malevolent chuckle of my stepfather. That scent of freshly cut grass. It pulled me back through time, away from the sterile smell of the ambulance and the stench of gunpowder. It dragged me back to a 2-story house on a quiet, tree-lined street in Goose Creek, South Carolina. A town built in the shadow of the Naval Weapons Station Charleston, a place that ironically represented the very freedom I never had. From the outside, our house was perfect. Manicured lawn, a welcoming front porch with a swing, an American flag flying proudly. It was the picture of a happy, all-American family. Cruz Mayo entered my life like a savior after my father's death. He was a successful local businessman, charming, charismatic, the kind of man who remembered your name after meeting you once. The whole neighborhood was smitten. He brought my mother, Margaret, back from the brink of her grief, and for that, I was initially grateful. But the smiles he gave our neighbors never quite made it through the front door. Behind closed doors, his charm curdled into control. It started with whispers to my mother when he thought I couldn't hear. "Margaret, you can't let her be so sullen. No man wants to marry a girl with a long face like that." And my mother, already broken, would just nod. The control was a noose, starting as a loose thread of suggestions and glances, then slowly, methodically, tightening around my neck. He never hated me for what I did. He hated me for what I loved. It was a systematic campaign to dismantle anything that brought me joy, anything that was solely mine. In 7th grade, I won first place at the school science fair with a model volcano I'd spent weeks building. I brought the blue ribbon home, my chest puffed with a rare sense of accomplishment. That night, Cruz accidentally knocked it off the shelf while dusting. It shattered into 100 pieces of plaster and painted cardboard. "Clumsy me," he said, not even looking at me. When I was 16, I was invited to my first real dance, the Spring Fling. I'd saved up money from my part-time job at the local diner and bought a simple, elegant navy blue dress. I loved it. I felt almost beautiful in it. The night of the dance, as I was getting ready, Cruz walked into my room without knocking. He looked at the dress, a slow, contemptuous smirk spreading across his face. "That's far too revealing," he declared. Before I could protest, he grabbed a pair of scissors from my desk and methodically cut the dress to ribbons right in front of me. "There," he said, dropping the ruined fabric on the floor. "Now it's more appropriate." But the worst was the diary. It was a simple, lockable journal where I poured out all my secret thoughts, my frustrations, my foolish, childish dreams. He found it under my mattress. He didn't throw it away. He waited. A few nights later, at the dinner table, he pulled it out. My mother was serving sweet tea, the clink of ice cubes against glass the only sound. "Let's see what our little writer has been up to," he said, his voice dripping with false cheer. And he began to read. He read my private fears aloud, my silly crushes, my desperate dreams of one day seeing the world. He laughed, a cruel, booming sound that filled the small dining room, mocking every word. I sat there, paralyzed, my face burning with a shame so hot it felt like it was melting my skin. I looked to my mother, my eyes pleading with her to make it stop. She just looked down at her plate, slowly stirring her tea, the condensation dripping onto the polished wood of the table. That silence was the cruelest blow. The greatest pain of my childhood didn't come from Cruz's hand or his sharp words. It came from my mother's silence. I remember one evening I came home 5 minutes past my curfew. Cruz was waiting. He shoved me hard. I lost my balance and tumbled down the short flight of stairs leading to the living room, my body aching as I landed in a heap on the rug. I looked up, tears streaming down my face, my eyes finding my mother, who was standing in the kitchen doorway. I was begging her with my gaze, pleading for her to step in, to be a mother. She just turned away. "You shouldn't have made Cruz angry," she said, her voice flat, devoid of any emotion. Her silence was louder than any slap. It was a confirmation that I was utterly alone, that her love wasn't strong enough to shield me. It was the day I learned a bitter lesson. Silence is its own form of violence. The army wasn't a career choice. It was an escape plan. The prison of Goose Creek had invisible walls, and I knew there was only one way to scale them. Every morning, while the town was still shrouded in a damp, gray mist, I was out running. It wasn't for fitness, it was for flight. Every pounding step on the pavement was a step further away from that house, my bedroom transformed into a secret command center. Tucked away under my bed were maps I'd printed from the library, workout schedules I'd scribbled on notebook paper, and pictures of female soldiers cut from army magazines. They were my icons, my imaginary mentors, whispering of a world where strength was an asset, not a threat. The day my acceptance letter came, it felt heavier than a simple piece of paper. It felt like a key, a passport, a declaration of emancipation. I hid it under my mattress, in the same spot where he had found my diary. Cruz had been right about one thing he'd sneered at me once. "You'll never get away from me." But he didn't understand. I wasn't just planning to run, I was planning to fight. If you've ever had a secret dream that someone tried to crush, something that was yours and yours alone, hit the like button. And if you know what it feels like to hold on to that dream anyway, comment with a single word, survivor. Let's see how many of us are out there. I opened my eyes to the sterile white ceiling of a hospital room. The sharp antiseptic smell stung my nostrils. A dull, throbbing pain in my hip pulled me back to the present. My gaze drifted to the chair beside my bed. My dress uniform was hanging there, cleaned and pressed. It was an icon, too. A symbol not of an escape I had planned, but of a life I had fought for and won. The first few weeks at Fort Jackson were a special kind of hell. It wasn't the hell of emotional manipulation I'd known. It was a hell of the senses. The air in the barracks was thick with the smell of sweat, pine sol, and boot polish. And the shouting. It started before dawn and didn't end until long after sunset. The drill sergeants' voices were like drills boring into your skull, designed to strip away your identity and rebuild you from the ground up. "Move it, Dixon. My grandmother can run faster than you, and she's dead." Every yell was an echo of Cruz. Every time my arms buckled during push-ups, my lungs burning, His sneering voice would slither into my mind. Pathetic. Every failure felt like a confirmation of his lifelong verdict on my worthlessness. There were nights I'd lie on my bunk, a thin, scratchy wool blanket pulled up to my chin, the metal frame cold against my back, and I'd stare into the darkness, wondering if he was right. Maybe I was too weak. Maybe I had just traded one prison for another, more demanding one. But slowly, through the fog of exhaustion and self-doubt, I began to notice a crucial difference. Cruz's cruelty was for his own satisfaction. It was designed to break me down, to humiliate and destroy my spirit for his own twisted pleasure. The harshness of the army, I realized, had a purpose. It was designed to build, not to break. It was meant to save my life, and the lives of the soldiers who would one day stand beside me. When I failed, the drill sergeants didn't just scream. They made me do it again, and again, and again, until I got it right. Our platoon was led by Drill Sergeant Reyes, a woman who was barely 5 feet tall but carried the authority of a giant. One day, after a particularly grueling exercise, she gathered us around. "We yell at you," she said, her voice raspy but clear, "so that when bullets are flying over your head, you will still hear our commands over your own fear." This wasn't personal cruelty. This was preparation for war. For the first time, I understood that discipline could be a form of care. That realization was hammered home during an obstacle course exercise. I was hauling myself over a high wall, my muscles screaming, when my grip slipped. I landed hard, my arm twisting beneath me with a sickening pop. A sharp, blinding pain shot through my shoulder. But the physical agony was nothing compared to the wave of shame that washed over me when a drill sergeant got in my face. "What the hell are you doing, Dixon? Got a boyfriend waiting for you back home?" The words, though unintentional, were a knife to an old wound. He couldn't have known, but he had just echoed years of Cruz's taunts about my worth being tied to a man. The tears that welled up weren't from the dislocated shoulder. They were tears of pure humiliation. I had failed. Publicly. And I felt as worthless as I had on my dining room floor in Goose Creek. The person who pulled me from that dark place wasn't an officer, but another trainee. Her name was Maria. A tough, street-smart girl from the Bronx who rarely said more than 3 words at a time. Later that day, in the mess hall, she saw me sitting alone, picking at my food, my arm in a sling. She walked over, sat down across from me, and without a word, slid her tray with its untouched chocolate pudding cup over to my side. "Eat," she said, her voice gruff. "You'll need it for tomorrow." That small gesture did what no amount of shouting could. It broke through the wall of isolation I'd spent a lifetime building. I realized that here, if I fell, someone might actually help me up. They weren't just my friends. They were my platoon. My squad. It was a bond forged not in blood but in shared hardship, and it felt stronger than anything I had ever known. We were a collection of broken pieces from all over the country, being melted down and reforged into something new, something unbreakable. The real turning point, however, came on the firing range. I was terrified of the rifle at first. Every loud crack echoed the violence I had run from. My hands trembled. My first few shots missed the target completely. Sergeant Reyes came up behind me. She didn't yell. She spoke in a low, calm voice, adjusting my stance, repositioning my hands on the stock. "Don't fight the weapon, Dixon," she said, her voice right beside my ear. "Become a part of it. Your breathing, the trigger squeeze, the control. It's all you." I took a deep breath, letting the image of Cruz and his smug smile dissolve from my mind. I focused on the distant paper target, on the simple mechanics of the rifle. Breathe in, breathe out, squeeze, pop. The rifle kicked against my shoulder. A clean hole appeared in the center of the target. Pop. Another one, right beside it. Pop. A third. A small, tight grouping. A surge of something I hadn't felt before. A potent, thrilling combination of power and control shot through me. In that moment, I wasn't a victim of violence anymore. I was a person who held a powerful tool. And I was learning to wield it with discipline, with honor, and with purpose. That feeling of control. I held onto it. But now, lying here in this hospital bed, a dull ache radiating from the bullet wound in my hip. I can't help but feel the brutal irony. I learned to master a weapon with honor, only to be brought down by the same kind of weapon wielded by a man who has none. The days following my release from the ICU were a monotonous blur of white walls, antiseptic smells, and the rhythmic beeping of monitors. I was physically safe, but my mind was a battlefield. One afternoon, as I was staring at a water stain on the ceiling, tracing its shape with my eyes, a soft knock came at the door. I expected a nurse. Instead, General Robert Whitaker walked in. He wasn't in his decorated Class A uniform. He was wearing a simple navy blue polo shirt and khaki pants, looking more like a visiting grandfather than a four-star general. In one hand, he held a steaming paper cup from the hospital coffee shop. "I figured you could use something better than the battery acid they serve on this floor," he said, his voice calm and steady. My training kicked in. I fumbled to sit up to offer a salute, my body protesting with a sharp pain in my hip. He raised a hand instantly, stopping me. "At ease, Sergeant. That's an order." His presence filled the room, not with the weight of authority I was used to, but with a quiet, solid reassurance. He pulled up the visitor's chair, the vinyl sighing under his weight. He didn't see me as just a soldier who had been attacked. He saw me as one of his soldiers who had been attacked on his base, and he took that personally. We talked for what felt like hours. He didn't ask a single question about the shooting, about crews, or about the chaos on the parade field. Instead, he asked about me. He asked about my tour in Afghanistan, about the soldiers in my unit, about my ambitions for the future. He asked about Drill Sergeant Reyes and what she had taught me. For the first time in my life, I was speaking to a powerful man without feeling the need to constantly defend myself, to brace for the next verbal blow. The words just flowed out. I told him about the grit of Maria from the Bronx, about the moment on the firing range when I realized I belonged, about the strange and powerful alchemy that turns a group of strangers into a family. He listened, truly listened, with an intensity that made me feel seen. He would nod, his eyes thoughtful, and I saw a genuine understanding there that I had never known. At one point, I hesitated, my voice catching. "It's just, I feel so ashamed," I confessed, the words tasting like poison. Like somehow, getting shot was my fault. General Whitaker leaned forward slightly. His expression was stern, but his eyes were full of a fierce compassion. "Sergeant," he said, his voice low and firm, "the only one who should feel shame is the coward who attacks an unarmed soldier. You never, ever carry another person's shame. That is not your burden." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't just absolving me, he was arming me. After a long silence, he said softly, "Your father would have been proud." That was it. That was the phrase that broke the dam. A wall I had spent 20 years building, brick by painful brick, crumbled into dust. A sob tore through my chest, raw and ragged. The tears I had refused to shed for 2 decades. For the broken volcano, the shredded dress, the abandoned puppy, the stolen diary, they all came at once. I wept for the little girl who had been so utterly alone. And for the first time, I didn't feel weak for doing so. A few days later, his wife Eleanor came to visit. She was a volunteer at the hospital, a woman with kind eyes and a warmth that seemed to radiate from her. She carried a woven basket that smelled of home. Inside was a thermos of homemade chicken noodle soup, still hot, and a well-worn paperback copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. She didn't pry or offer platitudes. She simply sat in the chair by my bed, pulling out a pair of knitting needles and a ball of soft gray yarn. And she talked. She told me funny stories about the general when he was a young lieutenant, how he once tried to cook Thanksgiving dinner and nearly burned down their kitchen. Her presence was like a warm blanket. "Robert told me you're one of the bravest soldiers he's ever met," she said, her needles clicking softly. "But you also need to know that, in here, it's okay to be weak. Healing requires rest, not just resilience." That night, as I ate her soup, the rich broth and tender vegetables a world away from the bland hospital food, I realized what this feeling was. It was the feeling of family. Not the twisted, conditional version I'd grown up with, but a real one, built on a foundation of simple kindness and mutual respect. Before General Whitaker was reassigned, he came to see me one last time. He stood by my bed, his posture straight, his gaze direct. Cruz Mayo built a fortress of lies around himself in Goose Creek, he said, his voice laced with cold resolve. He convinced a whole town he was a saint. But he made one fatal mistake. He brought the war to my territory. He placed a hand gently on my shoulder. In the Army, we have a creed. We never leave a soldier behind. You will not fight this battle alone. It wasn't just a comforting phrase, it was a solemn oath. I looked into his eyes and knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that for the first time in my life, a truly powerful man was on my side. Hope, a feeling I had almost forgotten, began to flicker back to life inside me. The truth is your most powerful weapon, Sergeant, he said as he was leaving. Don't let anyone take it from you. After he left, the room felt quiet but no longer empty. I felt a sliver of strength returning. I reached for the remote and switched on the small television mounted on the wall. A local news channel was on, and my heart stopped. There on the screen was a slick, confident-looking man in an expensive suit. The Chiron identified him as Daniel Finch, attorney for Cruz Mayo. He was standing on the courthouse steps, speaking into a cluster of microphones. A tragic family dispute, the lawyer was saying, his face a mask of feigned concern. Mr. Mayo is a loving stepfather who was pushed to his limit by a deeply troubled young woman suffering from severe combat-related PTSD. The first bullet had torn through my flesh. The second one, fired from a million television screens, was aimed directly at my soul. I sat frozen on the hospital bed, the remote control clutched in my hand, watching as my story was stolen, twisted, and weaponized against me. The lawyer, Daniel Finch, was slick. He had a politician's smile and eyes that held no warmth. He stood on those courthouse steps and spun a masterful tale of a devoted stepfather, a pillar of the community who had been driven to a desperate act. Mr. Mayo, Finch said, his voice dripping with practiced sympathy, feared for his life. He was dealing with a stepdaughter whose severe combat-related PTSD had made her volatile and, tragically, a danger to herself and others. A news network, one of those 24/7 channels that thrives on conflict, cut to a panel of talking heads. A psychologist who had never met me offered a diagnosis on national television. A political commentator debated the optics of the situation. They even showed the photo, the Pulitzer-winning shot of the bloody salute. But they didn't call it an act of courage. They called it, as Finch suggested, a theatrical, attention-seeking gesture. A wave of nausea washed over me. I felt the hope General Whitaker had given me begin to curdle into a familiar, helpless rage. They weren't just telling lies, they were erasing my truth. And then it got worse. Much worse. The local news station in Charleston started running interviews from my old neighborhood in Goose Creek. They were Cruz's puppets, their strings pulled by years of his calculated charm. There was Mrs. Henderson from across the street, the woman who used to give me freshly baked chocolate chip cookies when I was a kid. She looked into the camera, her face a mask of concern, and said, "Cruz is a wonderful man. A saint, really. He put up with so much from that girl." So much! My mind screamed. He put up with me winning a science fair. He put up with me getting invited to a dance. Then they showed Mr. Miller, the man who used to cut our lawn. He nodded sagely, as if he possessed some deep insight. She always had a wild look in her eye, not all there, you know. These were the people who had watched me grow up. They saw me mowing the lawn, carrying in groceries, walking to the school bus. But they only saw what Cruz had wanted them to see, the mask of the perfect family man and the sullen, difficult child he had to manage. Cruz hadn't just manipulated my mother, he had manipulated an entire community. And his lies, repeated often enough, had become their truth. The poison began to spread online. I made the mistake of looking at the comments section on a news article. The words were a barrage of anonymous cruelty. She probably provoked him. She has that look. Real soldiers don't cry and get all dramatic. This is a stunt to get famous and a big payout. Typical of these vets coming back all messed up and expecting a handout. The seeds of doubt were sown, and they were taking root. The atmosphere in the hospital began to shift. The nurses who had been so kind now looked at me with a flicker of something new in their eyes, a mixture of pity and suspicion. Their smiles became a little tighter, their conversations a little shorter. I felt the walls of my room closing in, the same suffocating isolation I had felt in my childhood bedroom. Cruz, even from a jail cell, could still extend his toxic tentacles and imprison me. The hope I had felt just hours before now seemed like a distant, foolish dream. I was alone again. Just as the despair was about to swallow me whole, a different kind of broadcast interrupted the noise. It wasn't a talk show. It was an official press conference, live from Joint Base Charleston. The backdrop was a row of crisp American flags. At the podium stood General Robert Whitaker. He was in his full Class A uniform, his chest a testament to a lifetime of service, his 4 stars gleaming on his shoulders. He didn't look like a man joining a debate. He looked like a commander taking control of a battlefield. The room full of reporters fell silent as he approached the microphone. He adjusted it, his movements precise and deliberate. "I will say this once, and I will say it clearly," he began, his voice booming with an authority that cut through all the media chatter. There was no room for interpretation. I was there. I was a witness to a cowardly act of violence committed against an American hero on the day she was being honored for her service to this nation. He paused, letting his words sink in, his gaze sweeping across the reporters. The salute given by Sergeant Caitlin Dixon, while she was bleeding from a gunshot wound, was not a theatrical performance. It was not attention-seeking. It was the very definition of honor. It was the embodiment of the discipline and courage we instill in every soldier who wears this uniform. He wasn't just defending me. He was leveraging the full weight and dignity of the United States Army as my shield. He was telling the world that an attack on me was an attack on the institution he represented. "Sergeant Dixon is a credit to this Army and to this country," he concluded, his voice like steel. "Any suggestion to the contrary is a despicable falsehood. We will ensure that justice is served. We do not abandon our own." He didn't take any questions. He didn't need to. He simply turned, his face a mask of cold fury, and walked off the stage. I stared at the television, my breath caught in my chest. The wave of public opinion, which had felt like a tsunami about to drown me, had just hit a seawall. The tide was beginning to turn. I slowly reached out and pressed the power button on the remote. The screen went black, reflecting my own tired, pale face. He could have the television screens, he could have the neighbors, but he would not have my truth. I closed my eyes, took a deep, shuddering breath, and a cold, hard resolve settled in my soul. He was not going to win. The trial was Cruz's final stage, and he played his part to perfection. Dressed in an expensive charcoal suit, he looked less like a man on trial for attempted murder, and more like a respected businessman who had taken a wrong turn on his way to a board meeting. His lawyer, Daniel Finch, was just as polished, parading the familiar faces from Goose Creek to the witness stand. One by one, they repeated the well-rehearsed lies. Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Miller. They painted a picture of a difficult, troubled child and the patient, long-suffering stepfather who had done his best. I sat at the prosecutor's table, my hands clenched into fists in my lap, feeling the walls of the courtroom close in. It was the television trial all over again, only this time, the slander was happening just a few feet away. I could see the smug satisfaction in Cruz's eyes, a look that said, "See? My world. My rules." During a short recess right before the prosecution was set to call its next witness, I felt a knot of dread tighten in my stomach. I knew who was next. I pulled out the worn copy of Meditations Eleanor had given me and found the line I'd underlined. "The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury." I held on to those words like a lifeline, a shield of dignity against the lies that were about to come. The prosecution calls Margaret Dixon to the stand. A hush fell over the courtroom. My mother. She seemed to shrink as she walked to the witness stand, a small, fragile figure in a beige cardigan that seemed too big for her. She took the oath, her voice barely a whisper. As the prosecutor began his questions, she kept her eyes downcast, her answers mumbled and brief. She avoided looking at me, and she avoided looking at Cruz. Then it was Finch's turn to cross-examine. He approached her not with aggression, but with a sickening, predatory sweetness. "Mrs. Dixon," he began, his voice soft, "you love your daughter, don't you?" "Yes," my mother whispered, her eyes fixed on her hands. "Of course you do," Finch cooed. "So, can you tell the jury why you would stand by and allow her to fabricate such horrific stories about your husband, a good man who has provided for you both?" My mother flinched as if she'd been struck. My heart hammered against my ribs. I could see her retreating, folding into herself, becoming the same silent, defeated woman who had turned away from me on the stairs all those years ago. I thought, this is it. She's going to break. She's going to choose silence again. Finch sensed his advantage and moved in for the kill. He leaned in conspiratorially. "Mrs. Dixon, isn't it true that you were, perhaps, a little jealous of the attention your husband, Mr. Mayo, gave to your daughter?" The question was a masterpiece of cruelty designed to poison everything. It implied something sick and twisted, and it simultaneously painted my mother as a petty, jealous woman. The air was sucked out of the room. I felt the blood drain from my face, the sting of this final, public humiliation. But then, something happened. Something I had given up hoping for decades ago. As Finch stood back, waiting for her to crumble, my mother slowly lifted her head. For the first time, she looked directly at Cruz. And in her eyes, the fear that had lived there for 20 years was gone, replaced by a deep, smoldering pain. "He is not a good man," she said. Her voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was clear. It was steady. The entire courtroom was frozen. "He is a monster." Finch's smile faltered. "Your Honor, objection." But my mother kept speaking, her voice gaining strength with every word. "He hit her. When she got an award at the school science fair, he accidentally broke her project. When she was invited to her first dance, he took a pair of scissors and shredded her dress because he said it was too revealing. He found a stray puppy she was caring for and got rid of it, then told her, 'Weak things have no place in this house.'" She paused, taking a breath, her gaze never leaving Cruz's stunned face. "He took a kitchen knife and stabbed her basketball because she was late coming home. And I stood by, and I watched." Her voice broke for a moment, thick with shame. "I was a coward. I was too weak and too scared to stop him. But I will not be weak anymore." Finally, she turned away from Cruz and looked at the 12 strangers on the jury, tears streaming down her face, but her gaze was resolute. "Everything my daughter has ever done was to try and survive the man I brought into her life. She joined the army to escape that house, to become someone she could be proud of. And on the single greatest day of her achievement, on the day she finally succeeded, that man," she pointed a trembling finger at Cruz, "tried to take that away from her, too." The dam of Cruz's composure shattered. His mask of a calm, respectable businessman disintegrated, revealing the raging beast beneath. "You lie!" he roared, lunging to his feet. "You lying bitch! I gave you everything. I gave both of you everything. You owe me." It was pure, unfiltered, narcissistic rage. The court officers, the bailiffs, were on him in a second, struggling to restrain him as he thrashed and screamed obscenities. The jury stared, their faces a mixture of shock and disgust. He had done what we never could. He had shown them exactly who he was. In the midst of the chaos, as Cruz was being wrestled out of the courtroom, my mother and I locked eyes. No words were needed. In that single silent moment, a bridge was built across a 20-year chasm of pain and silence. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It was something more fundamental. It was understanding. That moment of a mother finally choosing her child. It's a powerful thing. If you've ever wished, just once, that a family member would stand up for you in the moment that mattered most, hit that like button. And if you feel comfortable, just comment with a simple, "I understand," below. As the heavy courtroom doors swung shut behind a still screaming Cruz, he managed to twist his head around one last time. His eyes, wild with hatred, found mine. "You took everything from me," he spat. I met his gaze, and for the first time, I felt no fear. Only a cold, calm clarity. "You never had anything that was truly yours to begin with," I said, my voice too low for anyone but myself to hear. The chaos from my mother's testimony and Cruz's subsequent meltdown left a ringing silence in the courtroom. He was gone, but his rage still seemed to stain the air. The jury looked shaken, their eyes wide. Finch, Cruz's lawyer, looked pale. His slick confidence finally cracked. He was a man who had lost control of his stage. I felt my mother's hand find mine under the table and squeeze. For a moment, we just breathed. The prosecutor, a calm and methodical man named Mr. Davies, let the silence hang for a moment longer, allowing the jury to fully absorb the raw, ugly truth they had just witnessed. Then he stood. "Your Honor," Davies said, his voice cutting cleanly through the tension. "Before I call my final witness, the prosecution would like to play a short video clip for the court. Exhibit C." The courtroom lights dimmed slightly, and a large screen descended from the ceiling. The footage was from the news coverage of the award ceremony. It was shaky at first, then focused. There I was, standing on the dais, a proud soldier. Then the scene dissolved into chaos. The sound was muffled, but you could see the sequence of events with chilling clarity. Cruz rising, the glint of metal, the way my body jerked back, the crimson stain blooming on my uniform. The camera zoomed in on my face, contorted in pain. And then, it captured the moment. The moment I gritted my teeth, forced my body upright, and brought my hand to my brow in a slow, deliberate salute as blood streamed down my side. The video ended. The screen went black. The only sound was the quiet hum of the projector. Mr. Davies let the image burn itself into the minds of the jury before speaking again. The prosecution calls General Robert Whitaker to the stand. If my mother's entrance had caused a hush, the general's name commanded a wave of reverential silence. The energy in the room shifted instantly. This was no longer a messy family dispute. This was a matter of military honor. He entered from a side door, and every person in that courtroom, including the judge, seemed to sit up a little straighter. He was in his full Army service uniform, the deep blue jacket immaculate, the rows of ribbons and medals on his chest telling the story of a 40-year career. Each one represented a tour of duty, an act of valor, a lifetime of service. He didn't walk to the witness stand. He strode, his posture radiating a quiet, absolute authority. He sat down, not with the weariness of a man in his 60s, but with the focused stillness of a commander on a battlefield. Mr. Davies approached respectfully. "General, would you please tell the jury, in your own words, what you witnessed on the day of the award ceremony at Joint Base Charleston?" General Whitaker did not tell a story. He delivered a report, his voice clear, precise, and devoid of emotion. It was the voice of a man accustomed to dealing in facts. At 14:32 hours, he began, "I presented the Army Commendation Medal to Sergeant Caitlin Dixon for her meritorious service in Afghanistan. At approximately 14:33 hours, the defendant, Mr. Cruz Mayo, rose from his seat in the audience, produced a .38 caliber revolver, and fired a single shot, striking Sergeant Dixon in her left hip. Every word was a hammer blow of fact. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. He was a 4-star general. His word was evidence." The jury listened, captivated. Davies continued, "General, the defense has characterized Sergeant Dixon's salute after being shot as theatrical. As her commanding officer and a witness, how would you describe it?" This was the moment. General Whitaker shifted his position slightly, turning his body to face the jury directly, making it clear that his next words were for them and them alone. "In over 40 years of service," he said, his voice now resonating with a deep, quiet power, "I have witnessed courage in many forms. I have seen soldiers run into enemy fire to save a fallen comrade. I have seen pilots hold their damaged aircraft steady so their crew could bail out. I have seen medics perform their duties under the most horrific conditions imaginable. He paused, letting the weight of his experience fill the room. And on that day, I witnessed a sergeant of the United States Army, having been shot and grievously wounded by a member of her own family, choose to ignore her pain, to ignore her fear, and to fulfill her duty by rendering a proper salute. That was not theater, ladies and gentlemen. That was the very essence of a soldier. That was honor in its purest form. A quiet sob escaped my mother next to me. I felt a single tear trace a path down my own cheek. Finch, looking visibly shaken, knew he had to try something. He stood, forcing a confident tone. "General, with all due respect, you've taken a personal interest in Sergeant Dixon's case, haven't you? Is it possible that your personal feelings for the sergeant have clouded your judgment?" The question was a desperate, slimy gambit, and it hung in the air like a foul smell. General Whitaker turned his head slowly and fixed Finch with a look of pure, unadulterated ice. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Counselor," the general said, his voice dangerously low and cold as steel. "My judgment was forged on the battlefields of Iraq and Afghanistan. It's on a battlefield that you learn, very quickly, to distinguish between courage and cowardice. And on that day, in Charleston, I saw both. It was a kill shot." Finch's face went white. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He had nothing left. He was disarmed, defeated. He mumbled, "No further questions, Your Honor." General Whitaker's gaze remained on the jury. He didn't look at the lawyer. He didn't look at the judge. He looked at the 12 ordinary citizens who held my future in their hands. "Does the jury," he asked, his voice ringing with absolute command, "have any questions for me?" Silence. A complete, stunned silence. No one moved. The chess game was over. Checkmate. And everyone in that room knew who had won. The judge cleared his throat. "You may step down, General." General Whitaker rose. He walked past the defense table without a glance. He walked past the prosecutor's table, and for a fraction of a second, he paused. He looked down at me, and his stern expression softened just enough for me to see. He gave a single, sharp, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a gesture of pity or comfort. It was a gesture of acknowledgement. A sign that said, "Mission accomplished, Sergeant." The hours the jury spent deliberating felt longer than my entire tour in Afghanistan. We sat in a small, sterile waiting room down the hall from the courtroom. My mother, General Whitaker, and Eleanor, and me. No one spoke. The only sounds were the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the distant, rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall, each tick a tiny hammer striking an anvil of suspense. The air was thick with unspoken hope and unspoken fear. This wasn't just waiting for a verdict. This was waiting for a lifetime of pain to be validated or dismissed. My entire reality was in the hands of 12 strangers I would never know. 12 people who had to decide which story to believe. Was I a decorated soldier, attacked in a moment of triumph, or a troubled veteran who provoked a desperate man? Was the truth I had paid for with my own blood heavy enough to tip the scales of justice? I looked at my mother's hands, trembling in her lap. Without thinking, I reached out and placed my own hand over hers. Her skin was cold, but she wrapped her fingers around mine, a silent acknowledgement that whatever happened next, we were no longer on opposite sides of a silent war. We were in this together. That small gesture of connection was the only anchor I had in a sea of uncertainty. The door opened and a bailiff stuck his head in. "They're ready," he said, his voice neutral. The walk back into the courtroom was the longest of my life. Every step echoed. The jury filed in, their faces as blank and unreadable as stone. They took their seats, none of them looking at me, none of them looking at Cruz. My heart pounded against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. I fixed my eyes on the jury foreman, a middle-aged man with kind eyes who worked as a high school history teacher. He held a single folded piece of paper. My entire life felt like it was written on that paper. He handed it to the court clerk, who handed it to the judge. The judge read it, his expression unchanging, and then handed it back. "Mr. Foreman," the judge said, his voice booming in the silent room. Has the jury reached a verdict? Yes, Your Honor, we have, the foreman replied, his voice steady. As he spoke, he briefly met my gaze, and for a split second I saw something. A small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a tiny gesture, a flicker of humanity, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me. On the charge of attempted murder, the judge continued, how do you find the defendant, Cruz Mayo? A deafening silence. The world stopped turning. I held my breath. The foreman looked directly at the man who had tormented me for 2 decades. Guilty. The word wasn't a shout. It was a quiet, solid, immovable fact that landed in the center of the courtroom and changed everything. A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled my knees washed over me. I didn't cheer. I just closed my eyes as a single, hot tear escaped and rolled down my cheek. Beside me, my mother let out a choked sob, but it was a sound of release, of a dam breaking after 20 years of holding back a flood. The word guilty was an antidote, a single dose of truth that began to neutralize a lifetime of poison. On the other side of the room, Cruz collapsed. Not physically, but his entire being seemed to implode. The smug confidence, the condescending smirk, it all vanished. No, he whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. He turned to his lawyer, his voice a harsh, desperate rasp loud enough for us to hear. Do something. This is your fault. You told me this would work. And then, the final mask fell away. The monster was loose. No, he roared, a primal scream of narcissistic fury. You can't do this to me. I gave them everything. He lunged forward, but the bailiffs were already on him, pinning his arms behind his back, forcing the handcuffs onto his wrists. He thrashed like a wild animal, his face purple with rage. They owe me! You hear me? You all owe me! The jury watched, horrified. This was the real Cruz Mayo, stripped of his expensive suit and his charming lies. A pathetic, raging tyrant who believed the world owed him everything and could not comprehend a reality where he was held accountable. As they dragged him from the courtroom, he was still screaming, his voice echoing down the marble hallway. The sound faded, replaced once again by the profound silence of the courtroom. The war was over. Stepping out of the courthouse doors was like stepping into another world. The muted, heavy atmosphere of the trial was replaced by the bright Carolina sun and a roar of applause. A crowd had gathered on the steps. Supporters, veterans, strangers who had followed my story. They cheered when they saw me. News cameras flashed like strobing lights. General Whitaker put a steady, protective hand on my shoulder, while my mother held my hand tightly, her grip unwavering. Through the sea of faces, I saw them. A group of about a dozen women, all wearing caps and jackets identifying them as military veterans. They were holding a large hand-painted banner. It read, SGT, Dixon, Honor, Courage, Resilience. Seeing that sign, I realized this was no longer just my story. It had become a symbol for others who had fought their own silent wars. A reporter pushed a microphone into my face. Sergeant, how do you feel right now? She yelled over the noise. I looked past her, at the women holding the banner, at the hopeful faces in the crowd, at my mother and the Whitakers standing beside me, my family. The legal battle was over, but I knew another journey was just beginning. Today, I said, my voice clear and steady, amplified by a dozen microphones, I feel free. In the days following the verdict, the adrenaline of the victory faded, leaving behind a hollow, ringing exhaustion. The reporters eventually packed up their vans, the supportive phone calls dwindled, and the world moved on to the next headline. I returned to my small, quiet apartment near the base, and the silence was deafening. There were no more calls from lawyers, no more breaking news alerts. There was just me, the 4 walls, and the ghosts of the past. The scar on my hip was healing, a puckered, angry red line that was a constant physical reminder. But I quickly learned that the external wounds are the easy ones. The internal ones, the ones carved into your soul over 2 decades, those don't close up so neatly. I found that winning in a courtroom is not the same as winning the war inside your own head. Cruz's voice, that condescending, critical whisper, was a phantom limb I could still feel. An echo that surfaced in the quietest moments, telling me I was worthless, that I was nothing without him to fight against. My relationship with my mother, Margaret, began again with the awkward, hesitant steps of two strangers learning to walk together. We started taking long, quiet walks along the banks of the Cooper River, the warm, humid air thick with things unsaid. We talked about everything and nothing. The weather, a new recipe she'd tried, a show she was watching on TV. We were both carefully, painfully, walking around the giant, invisible elephant in the room. The 20 years of silence. Then one afternoon, as we watched the sunlight glitter on the water, she stopped and turned to me. Her eyes were filled with a shame so profound it was painful to see. "Caitlin," she said, her voice trembling, "I am so sorry. I'm sorry I didn't protect you. I was a coward." The younger version of me, the little girl who had cried on the stairs, wanted to say, "It's okay, Mom." To smooth it over, to make her feel better. But that would have been a lie, another layer of silence over the truth. So instead, I told her the truth. "Yes," I said softly, my voice clear. "You were, and it hurt me more than anything he ever did." She flinched, and tears welled in her eyes, but she nodded, accepting it. "But," I continued, taking her hand, "you told the truth when it mattered most. You stood up. And for me, that's a beginning. We didn't erase the past. We couldn't. But we finally agreed to carry it together." A few weeks later, I found myself sitting in a circle of plastic chairs in a sterile, windowless room at the VA Medical Center. It was a PTSD support group for service members. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't introduce myself as the hero from the news. I just said, "My name is Caitlin. I'm a sergeant." I spoke not of the medal or the salute, but of the long, quiet nights, of the feeling of being a survivor in a world that only wanted to see a symbol. For the first time, I wasn't a headline. I was just a person, sitting among peers who understood that the deepest scars are the ones no one can see. The healing was fragile, though. One evening, my mother, in a genuine but misguided attempt at closure, brought up a subject that sent a chill down my spine. "I was just thinking," she said tentatively, "do you think you might ever visit Cruz in prison? People can change, honey. Maybe he's different now." The question, born of her own need for a tidy ending, felt like a betrayal. It showed me how truly alone I was in the depth of my trauma. I took a deep breath, pushing down the flare of anger. "Mom," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "Forgiveness and reconciliation are two different things. I have to find a way to forgive, for my own peace. But that doesn't mean I have to let the man who tried to destroy me back into my life in any way. Some doors have to stay closed. Forever." I thought of a quote I'd read from Maya Angelou. "When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time." Cruz had shown me who he was 1,000 times over. I had to believe him. A few months after the trial, a letter arrived. The return address was the South Carolina State Penitentiary. My hands shook as I opened it. It was from Cruz. 10 pages, front and back, written in his precise, arrogant script. It wasn't an apology. It was a manifesto of blame. He blamed my mother for being weak, his lawyer for being incompetent, General Whitaker for being biased, and most of all, he blamed me. He called me a liar, a manipulator, an ungrateful parasite who had orchestrated his downfall. The last line was burned into my memory. "You destroyed my life, and you will rot in hell for it." Reading it, I waited for the familiar surge of rage or the crushing weight of despair. But instead, a strange and unexpected emotion washed over me. Pity. He was a man so consumed by his own narcissism that he was utterly incapable of seeing the truth. He would spend the rest of his life in a prison of his own making, long after his official sentence was served. He would forever be the victim in his own twisted story. I took out a piece of paper and a pen. I wrote a response, a furious, cathartic letter pouring out 20 years of pain and rage. I filled pages with every ugly truth, every silent scream. When I was done, My hand ached and my cheeks were wet with tears. I read it over once, then folded it neatly. I thought about mailing it. I thought about giving him that last piece of myself. But then I put it in a small metal bowl in my kitchen sink. I struck a match. The flame caught the corner of the paper, and I watched as the angry words curled into black ash. The fire consumed my rage, my pain, and my last connection to him. I decided then and there that my silence would be my final answer. I would not give him another word, another thought, another second of my life. The most powerful boundary I could set was to simply stop participating in his chaos. Later that night, I found an old wooden box in the back of my closet, a box where I kept a few meaningless trinkles from Goose Creek. I took his letter, the one from prison, and placed it inside. I didn't tear it up. Tearing it up would give it power. Instead, I just put it away, a relic from a life that was no longer mine. I closed the lid, the soft click of the latch echoing in the quiet room. It was done. The past was not erased, but it was contained. The physical recovery was grueling. It was a slow, painful process of rebuilding muscle, of learning to trust my body again. There were days the pain in my hip was a grinding, relentless reminder, and the frustration felt overwhelming. But every morning, I woke up and treated my rehabilitation like a mission. I approached physical therapy with the same discipline that had gotten me through basic training, pushing through the pain, focusing on the small victories. One more step, one more pound of resistance. When I was finally cleared for active duty and walked back into my unit's headquarters, I was braced for the looks of pity, for the awkward questions. But they never came. Instead, I was greeted with quiet nods of respect, with handshakes that were a little firmer than before. My battle buddies didn't see a victim. They saw a soldier who had faced a different kind of enemy and had won. The scar on my hip, which I had once hidden under my uniform, no longer felt like a mark of shame. It was an invisible medal, a testament to the hardest fight of my life. But as I settled back into the routine of military life, I realized something had fundamentally changed within me. My own story, which I had fought so hard to reclaim, felt bigger than just my own survival. I started volunteering on weekends at a domestic violence shelter that served military families in the Charleston area. There, in the quiet conversations with spouses and service members, I saw my own pain reflected in their eyes. I understood, in a way few could, the unique prison of being abused within a culture that prizes strength and silence above all else. How do you ask for help when your entire world tells you to be strong? How do you report abuse when it comes from someone inside the very community that is supposed to be your unbreakable support system? I saw a gap, a need for a safe harbor built by one of our own. With a detailed proposal in hand, I requested a meeting with General Whitaker. He listened intently as I laid out my vision. A confidential, peer-led support network for service members and their families facing domestic abuse. A place where a soldier could speak to another soldier without fear of judgment or career repercussions. He didn't hesitate. "This isn't just a good idea, Sergeant," he said, his eyes filled with a paternal pride. "It's a necessary one. You'll have my full support." And so, with his backing, Project Silent Comrade was born. It started as a simple, anonymous hotline and a weekly support group, but it grew quickly, becoming a vital, trusted resource on the base. We weren't just offering help. We were changing the conversation, breaking the toxic silence one soldier, one family at a time. 1 year to the day after I was shot, I found myself standing on that same parade ground at Joint Base Charleston. But this time, the air wasn't thick with tension. It was filled with the warm, late afternoon sun and a sense of profound peace. I was there to be honored as the base's Soldier of the Year, not for what I had endured, but for what I had built in its aftermath. The presenter was General Whitaker. It was one of his last official acts before his retirement. He stood before me, his own uniform adorned with the legacy of a lifetime. As he pinned the new medal to my chest, he leaned in close. "I told you your father would be proud," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "And so am I, Sergeant. So am I." My vision blurred with tears as he stepped back and saluted me. I returned the salute, my own hand steady and sure. Then it was my turn to speak. I walked to the podium and looked out at the crowd. I saw the faces of my fellow soldiers. I saw the men and women who had found the courage to call our hotline. And in the front row, I saw my mother. She wasn't crying tears of pain anymore. She was smiling, her face radiant with a happiness I hadn't seen since I was a little girl. I took a deep breath, the clean, salt-tinged air filling my lungs. 1 year ago, on this very field, I was wounded. I began, my voice clear and strong. And I performed a salute that many have called an act of bravery. But today I want to talk about the scar that bullet left behind. I touched my hip through the fabric of my uniform. For a long time, I saw this scar as a symbol of my weakness, a reminder of a moment I was broken. But I've learned that our scars are not our endings. They are not periods. They are commas, places where a new and often stronger story begins. I looked out at the faces before me. I've learned that true courage isn't about standing up alone in your darkest moment. True courage is about what you do after that moment. It's about reaching back into the darkness to create a place where no one has to stand up alone ever again. I thought of the Army's creed, the promise we make to each other on the battlefield. In the Army, we have a warrior ethos. I will never leave a fallen comrade. But that promise shouldn't end when we take off our uniforms. It has to follow us home. It has to apply to our battles here on the home front. We have to be each other's battle buddies, in and out of uniform. I finished, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, the entire parade ground rose to its feet in a wave of thunderous applause. The bloody salute of a year ago was no longer a memory of personal survival. It had been transformed. It had become a legacy of hope, a lasting reminder that from our deepest wounds, the greatest strength can be born. My story found its ending, or rather, its new beginning, on that parade ground. It's a reminder that our deepest wounds don't have to define us. They can become the source of our greatest purpose. Thank you for walking this path with me. Many of you have shared your own stories of resilience in the comments, and you've become my silent comrades too. If my journey has resonated with you, please hit like and subscribe for more stories of survival and hope. And for one last time, let me know in the comments, what is one word for the strength you found in your life?